The candle on Josephine Hale's writing table had burned down to a third of its height, and the letter in front of her was already on its second draft. Outside, the village of Thistlecombe was entirely silent. No cartwheels, no voices, nothing but the occasional settling of the old schoolhouse timbers and the faint scratch of her pen moving across the page. She was in her dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders, the cold cream she'd applied an hour ago still white at her temples and jaw, and she was in the particular state of tiredness that strips a person of every pretense and leaves only the thing they actually think. What she actually thought at 11 minutes past midnight on the 14th of October was that the Duke of Merefield had been inexcusably cold to his own niece in the carriage yard that afternoon. In front of the cook, 2 students, and Josephine herself. And that someone ought to tell him so plainly before Alice spent another night wondering what she'd done wrong. She was halfway through the sentence. Your Grace, I write not to presume upon our professional arrangement, but to observe that a child of 12, recently orphaned, is perhaps not best served by a guardian who addresses her as though she were a quarterly account. When the knock came at her door, she assumed it was Martha, the housemaid, with the hot water she'd forgotten to bring up. She did not reach for her cap. She did not look in the glass. She simply crossed the room and opened the door. Sebastian Grantham, Duke of Merefield, was standing in her narrow upstairs hallway with his hat in one hand and the expression of a man who had prepared a speech and was now, upon seeing her, entirely uncertain of every word. He was still in his traveling coat, which told her the carriage had not been repaired. His dark hair was wind-disordered. There was a smear of road dust along one cheekbone. And he was looking at her, at the cold cream, the loose hair, the dressing gown, with an expression that was not quite horror and not quite anything else she could name. Josephine did not step aside. Miss Hale, he said, I apologize for the hour. My carriage wheel broke in the village and I came to, that is, I wished to speak with you about this afternoon, Josephine said. He stopped. Yes. Good, she said. Then I will save us both the trouble of a letter. She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and she told him, not unkindly. She was tired, not cruel, but without any of the softening she would have applied had she been dressed, rested, or in possession of her usual professional caution. She told him that Alice had stood in the carriage yard for 6 minutes, waiting for him to acknowledge her arrival, and that she had counted those minutes herself. She told him that the child had not complained, had not cried, had gone upstairs and eaten her supper and done her evening reading without a word, and that this composure in a 12-year-old was not a sign of resilience, but of practice. She told him that whatever occupied his thoughts that afternoon, and she did not pretend to know what it was, it had been visible to every person in that yard, and the one person it had cost the most was the one least able to say so. He stood through all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not assume the particular expression of a man enduring a subordinate's overreach. The slight tightening around the eyes, the fractional lift of the chin. He simply listened, his hat turning slowly in his hands. And when she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she became aware, for the first time, of how she must look to him. Face white with cream, hair falling to her waist, standing in a doorway at midnight, telling a duke what she thought of him. She felt the absurdity of it arrive approximately 3 seconds before he did. He started to laugh. Not a polished, social laugh. Not the controlled exhale a man of his position might deploy to diffuse a situation. This was a real laugh, involuntary and surprised. the kind that comes from somewhere below the chest, and it lasted just long enough that he had to press the back of one hand briefly to his mouth to stop it. When he lowered his hand, his expression had changed entirely. The careful arrangement of his face, the composure she'd noticed every time she'd seen him, the precise blankness of a man who had decided long ago that no one would ever read him, was gone. He looked for approximately 4 seconds, like someone younger and considerably less managed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I am not laughing at you. I am laughing because you are entirely correct, and I had no idea anyone was going to say that to me tonight. And I find He stopped. He tried again. "I came to apologize to you for Alice's sake, and instead you've done it better than I was going to, and I cannot find it in me to resent that." Josephine regarded him. "That isn't quite an apology to Alice." "No," he said. "It isn't." He looked down at the hat in his hands. "I had come from my solicitor's office when I arrived this afternoon. There were matters concerning the estate. I handled it badly. She deserved better from me." He said the last sentence as though it were the first honest sentence he had spoken in a long time, and from the slight pause before it, Josephine suspected it was. He turned to leave. She moved to take the candle from the hall table to give him light for the stairs, and she nearly knocked it from its holder. His hand came up, fast, automatic, and covered hers on the brass handle before the flame could go sideways. He steadied it. His hand stayed there half a second longer than steadying required, and then he took it away. Neither of them mentioned it. "Good night, Miss Hale," he said. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, listening to his footsteps descend the stairs. Then she returned to her writing table, looked at the unfinished letter, and did not send it. The formal note arrived 3 days later. It was correctly worded, appropriately brief, and concerned Alice's autumn examination schedule, a matter his secretary could have handled by post without any particular difficulty. Josephine wrote back with equal correctness and thought nothing more of it. 2 days after that, the Duke's carriage appeared in the lane outside Thistlecombe's front gate, and Sebastian himself came to the door to inquire whether a pair of riding gloves might have been left in the front parlor during his last visit. Josephine received him in the parlor, checked the window seat and the side table, and found no gloves. He thanked her with every appearance of genuine disappointment and left. She mentioned this to no one. On the third occasion, a question about a proposed donation to the school library, a matter his solicitor could have raised by letter and resolved within a week. Josephine sat across from him in the front parlor in her best day dress and answered every question with complete professionalism. He stayed for 20 minutes. He asked about Alice's progress in composition and whether the girl had made any particular friends among the other students. His expression when Josephine described Alice's recent friendship with the daughter of a Bristol merchant was not the expression of a man conducting a routine welfare inquiry. That evening, Alice mentioned at supper, to no one in particular, that her uncle seemed to be in better spirits lately. One of the younger students asked whether he was handsome. Alice considered this with great seriousness and said she supposed he was, if you liked that sort of thing. Josephine returned to her marking. The following Thursday, Lady Osgood's hired carriage came through the village lane at its usual unhurried pace and slowed, visibly, deliberately slowed, at the sight of the Duke's horses standing at the schoolhouse gate. Josephine watched from the front parlor window. The carriage did not stop. It moved on. But Lady Osgood was a woman who noticed things and filed them away with the careful patience of someone who intended to use them. And Josephine stood at the window after the carriage had gone and felt, for the first time, the distinct shape of a problem forming at the edge of her carefully constructed life. He came the following week, under the stated purpose of reviewing Alice's term marks. Josephine had the marks in her hand when he arrived. She'd prepared them specifically, arranged them on a single sheet, so that the entire conversation could be concluded in 2 minutes, and the visit could end before it became anything that Lady Osgood's coachman could report back. Instead, she walked him into the school garden. She was not certain, afterward, why she had done it. The afternoon was gray, the garden's autumn beds mostly bare, and there was nothing to recommend it as a meeting place over the perfectly adequate front parlor. But the front parlor felt like a performance, and she was tired of performing things, and so she took him into the garden and said, without preamble, "Why does a duke ride 2 hours to discuss marks that his secretary could have collected by post?" Sebastian looked at her with the expression of a man who has a very good deflection prepared. "Alice's education is a matter I take seriously." "I know you do," Josephine said. "That isn't what I asked." "The personal attention of a guardian. Your solicitor handles Alice's enrollment fees, her term scheduling, and her travel arrangements," Josephine said. "You have visited 4 times in 3 weeks. I would like to know why." He tried once more. "The school's autumn fundraiser is approaching, and as a patron, Mr. Grantham," Josephine said, and used the name deliberately, without the title, and watched his expression shift. "I have been dismissed from one post for saying what I actually thought when a polished answer was expected. I did not find the experience enjoyable, but I did find it clarifying. So I will ask you once more, plainly, why are you here?" The silence that followed was not an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of a man deciding something. "You are remarkably difficult to deflect," Sebastian said. "I've been told that," Josephine replied. "I've also been told it's a professional liability. I remain unconvinced." "Who told you that?" "The family who dismissed me. They wanted a mark changed on their daughter's examination to reflect what the girl's father had paid for, rather than what the girl had actually learned. I declined. They described my refusal as impertinence." She said it evenly. "I described it as arithmetic." Something moved in his face. "And you built this school after?" "With what was left of my aunt's bequest and a great deal of stubbornness, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father believed that showing what you felt was an invitation to be used. He said it the way a person says something they didn't intend to say, fast and flat, as though the speed might disguise the weight of it. He was not a man who could be in a room without knowing who held the advantage. He taught me that being unreadable was the only safe way to be." He stopped. He looked as though he had just heard his own sentence from outside himself. Josephine did not press him. She waited, and the silence did what no argument could have done. "I don't know why I said that," Sebastian said. "I think you do," Josephine said quietly. "I think you said it because it's true, and you are not accustomed to rooms where that's sufficient reason." He looked at her for a long moment. Before he could answer, the first drops of rain arrived, fast, without warning, the way autumn rain does in the west of England. Josephine looked up at the sky with the expression of someone who has made a tactical error regarding the garden. Sebastian shrugged off his coat. He didn't ask permission. He settled it over her shoulders while she was still mid-sentence. She had been saying something about the covered walkway, and the warmth of it arrived all at once, carrying the smell of road and wool and something that was simply him. They walked back to the schoolhouse entrance under the rapidly increasing rain. The argument unfinished, the coat still around her shoulders, and neither of them said anything that was not entirely ordinary for the rest of the walk. She returned the coat at the door. He took it without comment. But as he turned to go, he paused with one hand on the gatepost and looked back at her. And the expression on his face was not the arranged one she'd first seen in the doorway above the stairs. "I will come again," he said, "if you'll have me." "You'll need a better excuse," Josephine told him. "I'll find one," he said. And he did not seem to find this a difficult promise to make. Alice had begun seeking Josephine out after the afternoon lessons were done. Not for help with her Latin, which was progressing adequately, or her composition, which was progressing remarkably, but simply for company. She would appear in the doorway of Josephine's small office with a book under her arm and ask, with the elaborate casualness of a 12-year-old who has not yet learned to disguise her own loneliness, whether Josephine was very busy. Josephine was always busy. She always said she wasn't. One afternoon in the third week of October, Sebastian arrived during one of these visits. He came around the side of the building rather than the front, which meant he passed the schoolroom window, and Josephine, who was showing Alice a diagram in the atlas, did not notice him until Alice glanced up and said, "Uncle Sebastian is standing outside." Josephine looked. He was there in the window frame, still in his riding coat, watching the two of them with an expression she could not entirely read from across a room. He had not knocked. He was not attempting to announce himself. He was simply standing there, watching his niece lean over a map with her finger tracing a coastline. And whatever he was feeling, he made no effort in that moment to arrange it into something less visible. He came to the door a minute later, apologized for interrupting, and asked whether Alice might like to walk to the village with him for tea. Alice said yes with a speed that suggested she had been hoping for exactly this. As they left, Alice slipped her hand into her uncle's arm with the ease of a child who has decided to trust someone and not yet been given reason to doubt the decision. Josephine watched them from the window and did not examine what she felt. The school's autumn fundraiser took place on the last Friday of October in Thistlecomb's Assembly Hall, which had been decorated by the students with paper garlands and handwritten signs describing the school's curriculum. Paying families came, and several patrons, and a small number of local merchants whose daughters were enrolled or might be. Lady Osgood arrived in a carriage that cost more than Josephine's monthly operating budget, and took a position near the fireplace with the settled authority of someone who considers the room partly hers. Josephine was near the entrance, adjusting a display of the students' written work that had developed an architectural instability, when Sebastian arrived with the other patrons. He greeted the room correctly, a word to this father, a nod to that merchant. And then he was beside her, and before she had registered that he was close enough to do it, he reached over and pressed a loose pin back into her hair with 2 fingers, automatic and unhesitating, as though this were something he did every day. He did not apologize for it. He simply said, "You're about to address the room," and stepped back. Josephine was aware, without turning around, that Lady Osgood had seen it. She could feel the particular quality of that woman's attention and the way you feel a change in the temperature of a room. She went in and addressed the room. She spoke about the school's enrollment figures, the examination results, the expansion she hoped to undertake in the spring. She was good at this, clear, specific, unhurried, and the room listened. Halfway through, she heard Sebastian laugh at something she'd said about the arithmetic results. A real laugh, the same involuntary one she'd heard in her hallway. And she did not look at him, but she did not lose her place either. Alice, seated with the other students along the side wall, leaned to her neighbor and said something quietly. Her neighbor nodded. Later, Alice would tell Josephine that she'd said her uncle never used to laugh in rooms like this. She said it as though it were a good thing. It was. Lady Osgood's morning room was everything. Thistlecomb's assembly hall was not. Small, expensive, and arranged for the convenience of the woman who occupied it, rather than the comfort of anyone who entered it. Josephine sat in the chair that had been offered to her and did not touch the tea. "I will be direct," Lady Osgood said, and was. She described the Duke's visits to the schoolhouse in the tone of someone presenting evidence. She described the evening of the fundraiser as though it had been a public scandal rather than a hairpin. And then she delivered the terms. A written apology, issued to the full patron list, acknowledging that Josephine had behaved in a manner that gave rise to misunderstanding. Language that would require Josephine to describe what had happened as something it was not. Or Lady Osgood would withdraw her patronage from Thistlecombe Academy, effective at the end of the quarter. Without Lady Osgood's contribution, the school could not meet its costs past February. "I will consider your proposal," Josephine said. She said it in the tone she used when she meant something else entirely, and Lady Osgood heard it, and neither of them said anything further. She walked back to the school through the cold morning. She sat at her writing table. She looked at the letter she had been drafting to Sebastian. An ordinary note, asking whether he might come the following Tuesday, and she did not send it. When he arrived 2 days later, she received him in the front parlor with Miss Cartwright, the junior mathematics teacher, present and occupied at the side table with a stack of exercise books. Josephine sat across from Sebastian and told him, in the pleasant, professional tone she used for conversations that were not pleasant at all, that his visits, for the time being, should be limited to matters directly relating to Alice's enrollment. He looked at her. She could see him reading the room. The presence of Miss Cartwright, the careful arrangement of her posture, the particular blankness she had put on her own face, which she knew he would recognize because he had worn something very like it himself. He asked no questions. He said he understood and thanked her for her time and left. That evening, his solicitor sent a letter to Lady Osgood's man of business. It was not about Alice Grantham's enrollment. Josephine did not know this yet. She spent the following 3 weeks doing what she was good at: writing letters, visiting patronesses, appearing composed in every room that contained someone who might be repeating Lady Osgood's version of events. She called on Mrs. Fairweather in Exeter, who listened carefully and said she would need time to consider. She wrote twice to Mrs. Alderton in Bath, who did not reply to the first letter and sent a cautious, non-committal answer to the second. She kept the school's daily routine unchanged: lessons at 8, examinations returned on schedule, the autumn concert rehearsals proceeding as planned. Because routine was itself a form of argument, a demonstration that nothing here was disordered. The rumor had reached 2 households by the end of the first week. By the end of the second, a third. It moved the way these things always moved, not as accusation, but as concern. The particular social vocabulary of women who wished to damage another woman while appearing to worry about her. On the night that Mrs. Alderton's second letter arrived, the cautious one, the one that meant she was withdrawing without quite saying so, the students were in their rooms and the school was quiet. Josephine carried the letter into the assembly hall, where the chairs were still in their rows from that afternoon's geography lesson, and she sat down on the bench at the side of the room and read it twice, and then sat still for a long time, not moving, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting in the dark with the specific weight of a thing she had built beginning to shift beneath her. She heard the door at the far end of the hall open. She did not look up. Sebastian crossed the room without speaking and sat beside her on the bench. He did not ask what had happened. He did not offer a solution or a speech. He simply reached over and took her hand, both of his wrapped around hers, and held it. She felt the shaking she hadn't known was in her own hands begin to stop. They sat in the dark for a quarter of an hour. The chairs stood in their rows around them. Outside, the wind had come up, and somewhere in the building, a door was moving on its hinges. "Thank you," Josephine said finally. Once, quietly. He nodded. He did not let go of her hand for another minute, and then he did. They sat side by side in the still dark until she was ready to stand up. She did not ask how he had known to come. She thought, perhaps, that some questions had answers that were better understood than spoken. The donation record came across her desk on a Thursday morning, brought by the school board clerk who was cross-referencing the autumn accounts and had found an entry he could not match to any patron on the current list. The sum was substantial. The source was listed as a private party routed through a neutral solicitor's office. Josephine looked at the name of the firm. She recognized it. She sat with the document for 20 minutes. Then she put on her coat and walked to the village inn. Sebastian was in the private dining room. A map and several letters spread across the table. And he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who has been half expecting something and is now deciding how to face it. Josephine placed the donation record on the table between them. "This is 6 months of operating costs," she said. "Routed through your solicitor's office. The dates begin the week after Lady Osgood issued her ultimatum." He looked at the document and said nothing. "You covered the funding gap," Josephine said, quietly, without telling me, "for 3 months while I was writing letters to women who were never going to answer them." "Yes," Sebastian said. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked up at her. "Because you would have refused it. That is not your decision to make." "I know," he said. "I know that." He pushed back from the table slightly, and she could see him choosing his words with unusual care, the way he did when he was trying to be precise rather than simply correct. "I did not want your gratitude. I did not want you to feel obligated. I did not want to be the reason you stayed in a situation that was harming you, if you had decided you wanted to leave it." "And what did you want?" Josephine asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Your good opinion," he said. Then he stopped, and something crossed his face. "No, that's not quite right either. It's closer to..." He stopped again. He looked at the table, and then at her, and she could see him arriving at the edge of something he did not have the words for. Josephine stood across the table from him for a moment. Then she walked around it, and she kissed him, brief and certain, one hand against his jaw. And then she stepped back. He looked at her. His expression was open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded, entirely present, as though whatever careful distance he had kept between himself and the world had simply ceased to apply. "I am still furious about the secrecy," Josephine told him. "I know," Sebastian said. Neither of them moved toward the door. The Thistlecombe Patron Gala fell on the second Friday of November. By 7 o'clock, the Assembly Hall held paying families, the full school board, 3 local magistrates, a solicitor from Exeter who sat near the back and kept his expression neutral, and 2 correspondents from the county newspaper who covered the kind of social event that occasionally became a different kind of story entirely. Lady Osgood arrived early and positioned herself at the center of the room with the ease of a woman who had never doubted her right to occupy any space she entered. Sebastian arrived with the other patrons at 7:30 and took a seat on the patrons' bench near the left wall. He did not look at Josephine, who was standing near the entrance. She did not look at him. They had not discussed what might happen this evening, and she was not certain either of them knew. The evening's formal portion began at 8. The school board chairman spoke briefly. 2 students performed a piece on the school's recently acquired pianoforte. Then the chairman gave the floor to Lady Osgood, who rose with the composure of a woman who has prepared her remarks and intends to deliver them. She began with the school's founding, which she described with warmth. She moved to the enrollment figures, which she cited with approval. She spoke about the value of education for young women of the merchant class and the importance of proper institutional governance, and the particular responsibility of a headmistress to model the conduct she wished to instill in her students. Each sentence was entirely correct. Each sentence was one careful step toward a destination that Josephine could see from where she was standing. "It is with some reluctance," Lady Osgood said, "that I must raise a concern that has been brought to my attention by several members of our patron community. A concern regarding the conduct of Thistlecomb's headmistress, and whether the school's reputation for propriety has been—" Sebastian rose from the patron's bench. He did not make a speech. He did not raise his voice. He reached into his coat and produced a slim, bound document, and he said, in a tone that was entirely conversational and carried to every corner of the room, "I beg the room's indulgence for a moment." Lady Osgood stopped. Sebastian opened the ledger. "The enrollment fees for Miss Alice Grantham, paid quarterly from her admission in January of this year," he read. "Paid on the 1st of January, the 1st of April, the 1st of July, and the 1st of October. Each payment made from my personal accounts, not the estate's." He turned a page. "The estate's accounts, for those interested, have been carrying my late brother's accumulated gambling debts for a period of 2 years and 4 months. The sum currently outstanding is—" and he named it clearly, into the silence of the room, "which I am in the process of resolving. The one bill I have paid without delay and from my own pocket throughout this period is Alice Grantham's education at this school." He turned another page. "A private donation made to Thistlecombe Academy in the 3rd week of October, following a conversation in which a patroness of this institution threatened to withdraw her funding unless the headmistress issued a public apology for having received a late evening visit from a guardian whose carriage wheel had broken in the village." He looked up. "The visit lasted approximately 20 minutes. It took place in a doorway. I was still wearing my traveling coat." The room was entirely still. Lady Osgood had not sat down, but she had not continued speaking. Sebastian closed the ledger. His hands, Josephine noticed from across the hall, were not entirely steady. He had just named his family's ruin in a room containing 2 newspaper correspondents, and the careful composure he'd worn every day of his adult life was lying somewhere on the floor beside the patron's bench, and he was still standing. He sat down. Josephine stepped forward from the side of the hall. She did not look at Sebastian, because if she looked at him, she would not be able to say what needed to be said. And what needed to be said required her to be the headmistress of this school, and not a woman watching a man expose his own ruin for her sake in a room full of people. "Thistlecombe Academy," she said, "was founded 4 years ago with a small inheritance, and the conviction that girls from merchant and trade families deserve the same quality of education as girls from any other. We have enrolled 43 students in 4 years. 31 of them are currently enrolled. Our examination results exceed those of every comparable institution in the county, and I will show those results to anyone in this room who asks to see them." She looked at the room, the board members, the parents, the magistrates, the 2 men with their notebooks. The Duke of Merefield's carriage broke a wheel in the village on the 14th of October. He came to this school to apologize, in person, for a moment of coldness toward his niece earlier that day. We spoke in a doorway for 20 minutes about a 12-year-old girl who had recently lost her father and deserved better from the adults responsible for her. That is what occurred. I did not invite him. I did not encourage him. I told him plainly what I thought of his behavior toward his ward, and he listened and he left. She paused. I would do it again. She let that settle. What you have heard from the Duke of Merefield this evening, Josephine continued, is a plain accounting of a private matter, offered at personal cost because a lie was about to be spoken in a public room. I am aware that kind of honesty is inconvenient. I am aware it makes some people uncomfortable. She looked briefly and without heat at Lady Osgood. I built this school on the principle that discomfort is not the same as harm, and that a woman who tells the truth about what she has done is owed at least the courtesy of being believed. She stopped. The room's verdict did not need to be spoken aloud. It was in the posture of the school board chairman who had straightened in his seat. It was in the expression of the merchant from Bristol, whose daughter was enrolled and who was looking at Josephine with the particular respect of a man who recognizes someone who has just done a difficult thing well. It was in the stillness of Lady Osgood, who had not sat down and had not continued her speech, and who would not, Josephine understood, be continuing it at all. Lady Osgood sent a formal letter to the school board within the week, withdrawing her patronage with language that was careful enough to be unquotable. Mrs. Fairweather, in Exeter, wrote 3 days after that to increase her annual commitment by a third. A Bristol merchant whose name Josephine did not recognize sent a note inquiring about a donation in memory of his own mother, who had wished for an education and not been given one. Alice heard the account of the gala from 3 different sources before breakfast the following morning. From her friend in the dormitory, from the junior mathematics teacher, and from the cook, who had been told by the coachman who had waited outside. She came to Josephine before the first lesson bell and hugged her without explanation or preamble, her arms around Josephine's waist with the uncomplicated force of a child who has decided that someone is worth holding on to. Josephine stood in the school corridor with her arms around Alice's shoulders and did not say anything for a moment. In the days following, she and Sebastian were both quieter than usual, the way people are after something large has happened in a public room and the room has finally emptied. He sent one note, brief, direct, asking whether she was well and whether she would consider walking in the garden on Saturday if the weather allowed. She answered it. They walked. They talked about Alice and about the school's spring expansion and about a book she had been reading that he had also read. And the conversation moved between these things with the ease of people who have stopped performing for each other and found the absence of performance comfortable rather than strange. 1 year later, in the same garden, in the same season, the lamp was lit in the sitting room window above the schoolhouse, and the evening had gone gold and then gray in the way October evenings do in the west of England. They were on the bench near the old stone wall, talking without particular urgency about Alice, who had done brilliantly in her spring examinations and was now writing letters to a girl in Edinburgh she'd met at a summer gathering, about the new enrollment figures, which were the best Thistlecombe had seen, about nothing of great consequence and everything that mattered. You are still the most difficult person to deflect that I have ever encountered, Sebastian said. You've improved considerably at not trying, Josephine told him. I've had practice, he said. You leave very little room for the alternative. That's what the family in my last post called impertinence, she said. I know what I call it, Sebastian said. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen in her narrow upstairs hallway with cold cream on her face and a letter half written on the table, younger than his title, unguarded, entirely his own. The evening grew cold in the way evenings do when you have stayed in the garden longer than you intended. Josephine stood and brushed the dry leaves from her coat, and Sebastian rose beside her. They walked back across the garden in the dusk, and she opened the door, and the warmth of the lit room came out to meet them. He followed her inside. The door closed behind them,